Zane never expected a quiet night in the small colony to end with a life-or-death situation. The stars above twinkled peacefully, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Zane, a mechanic by trade, was finishing his shift at the repair shop when a sudden noise pierced the calm. It was a loud crash, followed by a strange rumbling that shook the ground beneath his feet. He ran outside, his heart racing, trying to figure out what had happened. The source of the noise came from the nearby wilderness, dense trees, rocky terrain, and unexplored areas where few dared to venture. Zane grabbed his flashlight and a small emergency pack, making up his mind to investigate. He couldn't just ignore the sound. Someone, was out there. As he trekked through the underbrush, the night grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around him. The dense forest was full of strange noises, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Zane's flashlight beam danced across the trees, but there was no sign of what had caused the crash. He quickened his pace, his instincts telling him that he wasn't alone. After what felt like an eternity, he finally found it, the wreckage. A large silver spacecraft lay in a clearing, its hull crumpled and smoking. The craft was unlike anything Zane had ever seen. It had smooth, flowing lines and glowing symbols etched into its surface. The ship looked alien, no doubt about it. But there was no time to be amazed by the sight. The craft had clearly been damaged in the crash, and Zane's eyes quickly scanned the area for survivors. He heard a faint groan from inside the wreckage. Zane's heart skipped a beat as he hurried forward. There, lying half-conscious near the entrance of the ship, was a woman. She had an otherworldly appearance, tall, with pale skin that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Her long hair was a mix of silver and deep purple, flowing like water. But what struck Zane the most were her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and glowing with a soft blue hue. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, but her condition was clear. She was badly injured. Zane didn't hesitate. His training in emergency first aid kicked in. He rushed over to her, checking for a pulse. Her heart was weak but steady. There was no time to waste. Zane carefully supported her head and pulled her from the wreckage. She was light, but her limp form made it difficult to move her quickly. He cursed under his breath. "Stay with me," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. Zane dragged her through the dense forest, his muscles burning from the effort. Every time he thought he couldn't take another step, he remembered the fragile alien woman in his arms. He couldn't let her die out here alone. After what seemed like hours, Zane finally made it back to the colony. He was covered in sweat and dirt, but he didn't stop. He carried her straight to the colony's medical center, calling for help as he burst through the doors. The local doctor, Dr. Reed, was still on call, and she quickly assessed the situation. Zane placed the woman on one of the examination tables. Dr. Reed muttered to herself as she worked, scanning the woman's body with equipment Zane didn't fully understand. "She's in bad shape," the doctor said, her voice grim. "We need to stabilize her fast." Zane stepped back, his thoughts racing. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why was she in such a dangerous part of the planet? There were a million questions, but all he could do now was wait. Hours passed. Zane sat in the corner of the small medical room, occasionally glancing at the woman. She still hadn't woken up, but Dr. Reed assured him she would be fine once the treatment kicked in. Zane found it hard to relax. Something about the whole situation felt off. This woman, this crash, it was all too strange. The sound of a soft breath drew his attention. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, Zane thought he had imagined it. But then she stared at him, her glowing blue eyes locking onto his. She didn't speak, but her gaze was intense, like she was studying him just as much as he was studying her. "Hey, it's okay," Zane said, his voice calm but unsure. "You're safe. We'll figure out what happened." She didn't respond, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. Zane bent closer, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "I can't understand you," he said, unsure how to communicate. "Do you speak English?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and then she slowly reached out a hand. Zane hesitated for a moment, but then he took her hand in his. The touch was cold, almost unnatural, but there was something powerful about it. Her hand trembled in his grasp as she whispered a word, a name, perhaps, or a command. But the language was foreign to him. He couldn't make sense of it, but it felt important. Zane didn't know what to make of this situation. The woman, the crash, the strange language. It all seemed too much to understand. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary encounter. This wasn't a simple rescue mission. Somehow, in saving her, Zane's life had just become far more complicated. As he sat by her side, watching her slowly regain consciousness, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. This was only the beginning, and he had a feeling that the woman lying before him would change everything. The days that followed were filled with questions, confusion, and an uneasy sense of something bigger happening than Zane could understand. The alien woman, who he had come to know as Vera, was recovering slowly but steadily in the colony's medical center. She was still unable to speak much, and her strange language remained a mystery to Zane. But that didn't stop him from trying. Every day, he would visit her, bringing her food and speaking to her, hoping that she might respond. Dr. Reed, the colony's doctor, was doing her best to stabilize Vera. But the alien physiology was unlike anything they had ever dealt with. Vera's pale skin was starting to glow less brightly, but her strength was returning. She could sit up now, and when Zane entered the room, she would turn her glowing eyes toward him, though her face remained unreadable. Zane had never been a hero. He was just a mechanic, a guy who fixed things when they broke. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to do more for Vera. He owed her his help, after all. She had been lying unconscious in that wreck, injured and vulnerable, and he had saved her life. Now he wasn't sure where it would lead, but he felt a strange responsibility for her. One afternoon, as he walked into the medical room to check on her, Vera did something unexpected. She was sitting up, her long silver hair flowing around her shoulders, and she was staring at him with an intensity that made Zane pause. "Vera," Zane said softly, unsure how to approach her. To his surprise, she moved her hand, signaling for him to come closer. He hesitated but then walked over, sitting at the edge of the bed. Vera's eyes never left his face, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of emotion in her expression, something like gratitude or maybe trust. "Can you understand me?" Zane asked, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. She hadn't responded in a way that made sense before. But this time, something changed. Vera nodded slowly, the barest movement of her head. Zane blinked in disbelief. It wasn't much, but it was progress. He leaned in a little closer, his curiosity getting the better of him. "I'm Zane. You're safe here," he said, his voice calm. "I don't know what happened or where you're from, but I'm here to help you." Vera's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she motioned to the small data pad on the table beside her. Zane picked it up, and as he did, Vera reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. The touch was light but firm, and Zane felt a strange warmth spread through him. He didn't understand it, but there was something about this woman that was drawing him in. She pointed at the data pad, then at herself, and then at Zane. It took him a moment, but he finally understood. She wanted to communicate. With a deep breath, Zane powered up the data pad, activating the translator app. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he had. He tapped the screen and spoke into it. "I'm Zane. Who are you? Where are you from?" Vera stared at the screen for a moment before she took a deep breath, and the words came out, broken but clear enough to understand. "My name is Vera," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm from a world far from here. I am a refugee. My people were attacked. I was the last of my kind. Zane's heart sank. He could feel the weight of her words, and though he didn't fully understand the story, it was clear that Vera had been through something unimaginable. She was running, hiding, fleeing from something far worse than a crash. "You're safe now," Zane said, offering her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to worry about them anymore. We'll figure this out together." Vera's eyes seemed to brighten a little, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand and touched the side of her neck, where a strange mark glowed faintly. Zane wasn't sure what it was, but it looked like some kind of symbol. Vera's face darkened as she looked down at the mark, her eyes filled with sorrow. "What is that?" Zane asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. Vera shook her head slowly, as if the memory was too painful to share. She then pointed toward the door, her face determined. "I must leave," she said, her voice stronger now. "I cannot stay here. They will come for me." Zane's heart pounded in his chest. "Who will come for you? Who are they?" But Vera didn't answer. She simply stood up from the bed, steadying herself with the help of the table. Her glowing eyes locked with his, and she motioned for him to follow. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Zane hesitated, feeling a rush of fear and confusion. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. Vera was in danger, and if he didn't help her, she might not survive. Without another word, Zane stood and followed her out of the medical center. He didn't know where she was going, but he knew he had to be there. Together, they would face whatever came next. As they walked through the quiet colony streets, Vera's steps were swift and purposeful. Zane stayed close, his mind racing with questions. Who was she running from? Why was she so determined to leave the safety of the colony? And most importantly, what could he do to help? The answers weren't clear yet, but Zane had made up his mind. He was going to protect Vera, no matter what it took. And whatever she was facing, he would stand by her side. Zane didn't know what to expect when Vera led him out of the colony's medical center, but he never imagined they would be running for their lives just hours later. The moment they stepped outside, the air felt different, thick with tension. Vera's pace quickened, and Zane instinctively followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's going on, Vera?" Zane asked, trying to catch up. "Where are we going? What danger are you talking about?" Vera didn't answer immediately, but her eyes never left the horizon. It was clear she was looking for something, scanning the area as though she expected something, or someone, to appear at any moment. "They will come for me," Vera said in a low voice. "They are hunters. They track refugees like me. We have to leave now." Zane felt a chill run down his spine. The way she said it, so calmly, as if it was something she had experienced countless times before, made his stomach twist with worry. Who were these hunters? And why had they come all the way out here? Before he could ask more questions, a sharp sound shattered the night. The unmistakable hum of engines, too close. Zane's eyes widened as he looked up to see a small ship hovering high above the colony. It was moving fast, scanning the ground below with powerful searchlights. The hunters were already here. "They found us," Vera whispered, grabbing Zane's arm and pulling him toward the trees. "Run." Zane didn't hesitate. He ran alongside Vera, pushing through the dense forest, the sound of the ship's engines growing louder. The bright searchlights scanned the area, moving across the trees in a slow, deliberate sweep. Zane's breath came in heavy gasps as he stumbled over rocks and thick roots, trying to keep up with Vera. She was faster, her long legs carrying her effortlessly through the underbrush. But Zane did his best to match her pace. The forest was dense and full of strange, alien sounds, creatures moving in the darkness, branches creaking in the wind, the rustle of leaves. It was a strange, eerie place, but Zane's mind was too focused on the immediate danger to take it all in. All he could think about was getting away from the ship, from the hunters. He could hear them now, Voices, low and sharp, barking commands. The hunters were closing in. Zane glanced at Vera, her face set with determination. She looked like someone who had run from danger before, someone who had seen things most people could never imagine. But even with her experience, the fear was evident in her eyes. She wasn't invincible. She needed him now, and Zane wasn't about to let her down. They kept running, weaving between trees and ducking beneath thick branches. Zane's legs were burning with exhaustion, and his breath was ragged, but he refused to stop. His mind raced with thoughts of what might happen if they were caught, what the hunters would do to Vera. He didn't know if they would kill her or take her somewhere even worse, but he wasn't about to let that happen. Suddenly, Vera stopped dead in her tracks. Zane almost ran into her, but he managed to stop just in time. Vera held up a hand, signaling for silence. Zane froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The ship's engines were still overhead, but the searchlights had stopped sweeping the area. They were moving closer, circling around. Vera's eyes flicked toward a large, rocky outcrop up ahead. Without a word, she started moving again, but this time with more caution. Zane followed, his steps quiet and careful. They'd reached the outcrop, where the shadows were deep, and Vera led him around a bend in the rocks. There, hidden from the ship's searchlights, was a narrow tunnel leading deeper into the earth. "We'll be safe inside," Vera said, her voice barely above a whisper. Zane didn't ask questions. He didn't have time to. He followed her into the tunnel, his pulse still racing as they descended into the dark. The air inside was cool and damp, and the walls were rough, made of some kind of stone that Zane didn't recognize. The tunnel stretched on, winding deeper into the planet's surface. Zane couldn't help but feel a sense of claustrophobia. But he trusted Vera. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. Zane's mind was spinning. He had so many questions. Who were these hunters? What did they want with Vera? And why was she so important? Finally, they came to a stop. Vera turned to Zane, her face shadowed in the dim light. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were still sharp. "We'll rest here for now," she said, her voice low. "The hunters won't find us in these tunnels." Zane nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed her. How could they be safe in a place like this? But Vera seemed confident, and he had no choice but to trust her. They sat against the stone walls, both of them silent for a long time. Zane's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. He couldn't help but wonder if they were truly safe, or if the hunters would eventually track them down, no matter where they hid. Vera had said they were skilled, relentless. Zane couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. Finally, Vera spoke again. "The hunters are not ordinary people. They are mercenaries, hired by a powerful enemy. My people, my homeworld, were destroyed by them. I was the only one to escape. They will stop at nothing to find me." Zane listened, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had known Vera was running from something dangerous, but hearing it from her own lips made it all the more real. These hunters weren't just some random threat. They were part of something much bigger, something that could destroy entire worlds. He looked at Vera, his resolve hardening. He had already decided he would help her, no matter what. But now it felt like the stakes were higher than ever. "I'll protect you, Vera," Zane said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "We'll get through this together." Vera nodded, her eyes softening just a little. For the first time since they had met, Zane saw a flicker of hope in her expression. And though the danger was far from over, Zane knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. The tunnel was cold, the air thick with silence. Zane and Vera sat against the rocky walls, the only sounds the distant echoes of their breathing. For a moment, the world outside seemed far away, muted, distant, almost unreal. But Zane knew better than to relax. The hunters were still out there, And he didn't feel any safer just because they had hidden in these tunnels. Vera had said they'd be safe here, but Zane wasn't so sure. He had no idea how deep the tunnels went or how well they were hidden from the advanced technology of the hunters. He looked over at Vera, who sat across from him, her face illuminated by the dim light that filtered from a small crack in the ceiling above. Her eyes glowed faintly, their blue light casting an ethereal glow on the stone walls. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers absently tracing the strange glowing mark on her neck. Zane had noticed it before, but now, seeing her touch it with such quiet concentration, he wondered what it meant. It looked like some kind of symbol, an insignia of some sort. And from the way Vera had reacted to it before, it was clearly significant. "What is it?" Zane asked, his voice soft. "The mark on your neck. What does it mean?" Vera's hand froze, her fingers still resting on the mark. She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes drifting to the ground. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and heavy with emotion. "It's a symbol of my people," she said quietly. "The symbol of the Alorian." Zane blinked, not sure if he had heard her correctly. "Alorian? Is that the name of your species?" Vera nodded, her face somber. "Yes, we were once a proud and peaceful race, spread across many worlds. But that was before the invasion, before the hunters." Zane leaned forward, trying to understand. "The hunters, they came to your world and destroyed it." Vera's eyes flickered with pain, but she nodded. "Yes, they came in the dead of night, when we least expected it. The Alorian were peaceful, trusting. Too trusting. We didn't know the hunters were out there, waiting. They wiped out my people, leaving only a few survivors. I was one of the last." Zane's heart sank as he listened. He could hear the deep sorrow in Vera's voice, the weight of her past. She wasn't just running from a group of mercenaries. She was running from the remains of her destroyed civilization. "I'm sorry," Zane said, his voice sincere. He had never imagined that something so catastrophic had happened to Vera. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the last of her kind. Vera took a slow, steadying breath. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "But that mark, it marks me as a target. The hunters are relentless. They will not stop until they find me, until they finish what they started." Zane could feel the fear in her voice, and it only made him more determined to protect her. "But you don't have to face them alone. I'm here. We'll find a way to stop them." Vera shook her head. "You don't understand. The hunters are not just mercenaries. They are part of something much bigger. They are led by a man named Drax, someone I thought I would never see again." "Drax," Zane repeated, confusion flickering across his face. "Who is he? And why is he after you?" Vera clenched her fists, her eyes narrowing with anger. "Drax is a warlord, a ruthless leader. He was once an ally of my people, someone we trusted. But he betrayed us. He helped the invaders destroy my world. He was paid to do it, but he enjoyed it. And now he wants me dead to tie up loose ends. He wants to erase the last of the Alorian." Zane's mind raced as he processed this information. He could sense the rage and pain in Vera's voice, and he knew she wasn't exaggerating. Drax wasn't just some faceless enemy. He was someone Vera knew, someone who had played a direct role in the destruction of her home. And now he was coming for her. Zane didn't know much about warlords or galactic empires, but he knew enough to understand that Drax was a serious threat. "So these hunters are working for him?" Vera nodded. "Yes, they're his personal army, trained mercenaries, genetically modified to be faster, stronger, and deadlier than any normal soldier. They have advanced technology, weapons that could level entire cities. They won't stop hunting me until I'm dead. That's why we can't stay here. They'll eventually find this place." Zane stood up, a new resolve settling in his chest. "Then we need to do something. We can't just hide forever. We need to fight back." Vera's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, perhaps, or even a glimmer of hope. "You would help me," she asked, her voice hesitant. Zane didn't hesitate. Of course I will. You saved my life. Now, I'm going to help save yours. Vera studied him for a long moment, her glowing blue eyes searching his face as if trying to read his thoughts. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening. Thank you, Zane. You don't know what this means to me. Zane shook his head. I may not know everything about your past or your people, but I do know one thing. We're in this together, and we'll find a way to stop Drax. We'll stop the hunters. Vera's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was something sad about it. I hope you're right, she said softly. I hope you're right. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their situation sinking in. Zane's mind was spinning with the new information Vera had shared. Drax was no ordinary enemy. He was a warlord with a personal vendetta. And the hunters weren't just chasing Vera. They were hunting down the last of an entire civilization. But despite the odds, Zane knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Vera face this alone. They would fight back. They had no other choice. The silence in the tunnels was broken only by the distant hum of the ship's engines still echoing above ground. Vera and Zane sat in the dim light, their minds racing with the same thought. How to get out of the tunnel, how to escape the hunters, and most importantly, how to stop Drax. Zane stared at Vera, her expression troubled, her face pale from the stress and exhaustion. Her eyes, glowing softly, betrayed a sadness he hadn't seen before. The weight of her past hung heavily on her shoulders, and now it was Zane's turn to carry some of that burden. They couldn't stay here forever. The hunters would eventually search every inch of the planet until they found them. The only way to survive was to take the fight to Drax and his mercenaries. What's the plan, Vera? Zane asked, breaking the quiet. How do we stop them? Vera looked at him, her face set with determination. We can't face Drax directly. Not yet. He's too powerful, too well guarded. But there's a way to weaken him. Zane leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. How? Vera's eyes flickered as she spoke, her voice low but firm. Drax's power comes from an ancient artifact, something he controls, something that gives him influence over the hunters and their technology. If we destroy it, it will cripple him. Without it, his mercenaries will lose their edge. Zane nodded, trying to piece everything together. And where is this artifact? It's in a fortress, Vera said, her voice filled with reluctance. Deep within the enemy stronghold. A place so heavily guarded that even I couldn't get in alone. But it's our best chance. If we can destroy it, we'll take away Drax's greatest weapon. Zane thought for a moment, the plan seeming risky, but it was the only chance they had. How do we get in? Vera stood up, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. We'll need help. The hunters are everywhere, but there are others, resistance groups who've been fighting Drax for years. I know where we can find them. They've been hiding out in a small settlement, away from Drax's reach. Zane's mind raced. This was a bigger mission than he had anticipated, but it felt like the only choice. And how do we get to this settlement? Vera stepped toward the tunnel entrance, looking out into the dark. We'll need to be smart. The hunters have eyes everywhere. We can't just walk there. We'll need to move at night, stay off the radar, and avoid detection. Zane's heart pounded as he thought about the dangers ahead. Every part of the plan seemed fraught with risks. Yet, for some reason, he felt more determined than ever. If Vera was willing to fight for this, then so would he. I'm with you, Zane said, his voice resolute. Whatever it takes. Vera turned back to face him, her eyes filled with gratitude. For a moment, Zane saw something in her gaze, a flicker of hope. It was faint, but it was there. He wasn't sure if it was for him or for their mission, but it gave him a sense of purpose. We'll need supplies, Vera continued, her voice calm and steady. Weapons, food, and a ship to get us to the settlement. But most importantly, we need to move quickly. Drax won't wait. Zane nodded. I can help with that. I know a place where we can get supplies, a small outpost nearby. It's not far from here." Vera raised an eyebrow. "How do you know about it?" "I've been there before," Zane said with a shrug. "I used to do some freelance work for the local traders. They've got what we need, and they don't ask questions." Vera gave him a nod of approval. "Good. We'll head there tonight, while the hunters are still focused on searching the surface. We'll gather what we need, and then make our way to the settlement." Zane stood up, his mind now set on the path ahead. "All right, let's do it." The two of them made their way deeper into the tunnels, staying close to the walls and moving quickly. Zane kept glancing over his shoulder, always alert, always listening for any sounds that might signal the hunters were closing in. But for now, all was quiet. As they neared the entrance to the tunnels, Zane couldn't help but wonder what would happen if they were caught. They were going up against Drax and his army of mercenaries, and the odds were against them. But he pushed those thoughts aside. There was no turning back now. When they reached the surface, Zane took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the sky. The night was dark, the stars barely visible through the thick clouds. It felt like the perfect time to move unnoticed. They had to make it to the outpost before the hunters realized they were gone. They moved swiftly through the wilderness, keeping to the shadows. Zane knew these woods like the back of his hand, having spent countless hours there in his past. He led the way, with Vera staying close behind, her glowing eyes illuminating the path ahead. Hours passed as they trekked through the dense forest, always aware of the danger that lurked nearby. Zane's muscles ached from the constant movement, but he refused to stop. He wasn't going to let Vera down now. When they finally reached the outpost, Zane breathed a sigh of relief. The small settlement was quiet, its lights dim, and its inhabitants mostly asleep. Zane knew the traders who ran the outpost, people he could trust. They had dealt with him in the past, and he hoped they would be willing to help now. As they approached the door, Zane knocked lightly. The door creaked open, revealing a burly man with a grizzled face. His eyes narrowed when he saw Zane, but then softened when he saw Vera standing behind him. "Zane," the man grunted. "What brings you here at this hour?" Zane stepped forward, lowering his voice. "We need supplies, weapons, food, and a ship." The man eyed them both, his gaze lingering on Vera. After a long pause, he nodded. "You've got it, but it'll cost you. And I don't take kindly to questions." Zane nodded in return. "I understand. Just get us what we need." The man turned and motioned for them to follow. Zane's heart raced. This was their chance. They were one step closer to taking down Drax and ending the reign of terror he had inflicted on Vera's people. As they gathered the supplies, Zane couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. Time was running out, and the mission ahead was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But he was ready. He would do whatever it took to protect Vera and stop Drax. There was no turning back now. The outpost was quiet now, the supplies packed and ready for the journey. Zane couldn't shake the feeling that every step they took toward the settlement brought them closer to danger. But there was no turning back now. They had what they needed: food, weapons, and the ship. The next step was to get to the resistance group and prepare to take down Drax's fortress. Time was running out. Zane looked at Vera, who stood beside him, checking over their supplies. Her eyes were calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. She was worried, and he couldn't blame her. They were about to enter the lion's den. "We're almost there," Zane said, trying to sound reassuring. "We just need to stay alert." Vera gave him a small nod but didn't say anything. Her mind was clearly elsewhere, focused on the task ahead. Zane could only imagine the weight of everything on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for her own life. She was fighting for the future of her people, her entire species. The responsibility was enormous. They made their way to the ship, a small but fast transport vessel hidden in the forest's shadows. The ship was unremarkable, built for speed and stealth rather than firepower. It wasn't the kind of ship you'd expect to see in a battle, but for their mission, it was perfect. It was small enough to avoid detection, and fast enough to outrun most pursuers. Vera climbed aboard first, checking the controls as Zane followed. He secured the hatch and sat beside her, ready for whatever came next. The engines hummed to life as they took off, the ship soaring into the dark sky. Zane kept his eyes on the stars, but his mind was elsewhere. They had no idea what awaited them at the resistance camp. It was a long shot, but it was the best they had. As the ship traveled through the night, Vera spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Once we get to the settlement, we'll need to convince them to join our cause. The resistance isn't easily swayed. They've been fighting Dracs for years, and they've seen their fair share of failures. It won't be easy to gain their trust." Zane glanced at her. "You've worked with them before." Vera nodded. "I've met some of them, but it's been a while. They don't trust easily, especially not someone like me. My people were once allies with Drax's forces. To them, I'm just another reminder of the betrayal." Zane's heart sank. The last thing they needed was for the resistance to turn their backs on them. But he knew Vera was right. Getting their support would be harder than just asking for it. If they were going to have any chance of success, they needed the resistance on their side. "We'll convince them," Zane said with certainty. "If we can get them to listen. We can do this. We can take down Drax." Vera looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I hope you're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hours passed, and the ship moved swiftly through the cold, dark space. They passed through a dense asteroid belt, the small ship weaving expertly between the rocks. Zane's eyes never left the controls. There was no room for error, not when their lives were on the line. As the first light of dawn began to break, the silhouette of the resistance settlement came into view. It was hidden in a remote valley, surrounded by mountains. The settlement was small, but it was well defended. The fighters who lived there were seasoned, ready for battle at a moment's notice. Vera guided the ship down, landing on a quiet stretch of land just outside the settlement. Zane felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the moment of truth. He could see the faint glow of lights ahead, the distant hum of machinery. The resistance was awake, ready. But would they welcome them with open arms, or would they reject them outright? The ship's engines powered down, and the two of them stepped out, their boots crunching on the rocky ground. Vera led the way, moving confidently toward the settlement's entrance. Zane followed close behind, his hand on the blaster at his side. They had to be ready for anything. When they reached the gates, two armed guards stepped forward, their weapons drawn. They eyed Zane and Vera with suspicion, their fingers hovering near their triggers. Vera held up her hands, signaling for calm. "I'm here to speak with Commander Lyra," Vera said, her voice firm but respectful. "Tell her Vera is here. It's important." The guards exchanged a glance before one of them nodded and turned toward the entrance. "Wait here," he ordered. The other guard kept his weapon trained on them, his eyes narrow and cautious. Zane felt the tension in the air. They were walking a fine line. One wrong move, and this could turn into a firefight. Moments later, a woman appeared in the doorway. She was tall, with short cropped hair and a scar running down her left cheek. Her eyes were sharp, filled with a kind of quiet authority. She was the leader of the resistance, Zane realized, and the way she carried herself left no doubt that she had seen more than her fair share of battles. Vera stepped forward, her gaze steady. "Commander Lyra," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need your help." Lyra studied her for a long moment before her eyes flicked to Zane, taking in his presence. She didn't seem surprised, but she was cautious. "And why should I help you?" she asked, her tone cool. "You're one of Drax's people." Vera's face tightened. "I was. But Drax betrayed my people, and I've been running ever since. I'm not the enemy anymore." Lyra's expression didn't change. "Prove it." Zane could feel the tension rise. This was it, the moment where their fate was decided. Vera stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "We need your help to stop Drax. He's a threat to all of us, and if you don't act, he'll destroy everything." Lyra didn't say anything for a long time, her eyes never leaving Vera's face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "All right. Come inside. But understand this. We don't trust easily. Prove yourself, and we'll see what we can do." Zane exhaled, relieved, but he knew this was just the beginning. They had gained entry to the settlement, but the real battle was still ahead. The tension in the resistance camp was thick as Zane and Vera stood before Commander Lyra. The resistance fighters around them watched with suspicion, hands hovering over their weapons. Trust was hard to come by in times of war, and Vera's past made it even harder. Zane knew they had no choice but to prove themselves. "We don't have time to argue," he said firmly. "Drax is growing stronger every day. If we wait too long, we'll lose any chance we have to stop him." Lyra folded her arms, studying them both. "And you expect us to just believe you?" Vera stepped forward, her glowing eyes filled with determination. "I know how to destroy Drax's artifact, the one that gives him power over the hunters. Without it, his forces will collapse. But we can't do it alone." Lyra remained silent for a moment before finally sighing. "You're asking us to risk everything on your word alone." "I'm asking you to fight for freedom," Vera countered. "If we fail, there won't be a resistance left. Drax will hunt you all down one by one." The commander's sharp gaze locked onto Vera's for a long moment. Then she turned to her people. "Prepare for battle," she ordered. "We move at dawn." The camp erupted into motion. Fighters rushed to gather weapons, ships were prepped, and strategies were drawn. The final battle was coming. The next morning, the resistance forces moved under the cover of thick clouds, flying low toward Drax's stronghold. Their fleet was small compared to his army, but surprise was on their side. Inside one of the ships, Zane adjusted his gear, his heart pounding. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a man who had gotten caught up in something far bigger than himself. And yet, looking at Vera, he knew why he was here. She was no longer just an alien woman he had saved. She was his reason to fight. Vera caught him staring and gave him a small smile. "Nervous?" Zane smirked. "Only a little." Vera reached over and squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this. Together." As they approached Drax's fortress, alarms blared. The element of surprise was gone. Hunters took to the skies, their ships swarming like a black cloud. "Here they come," someone shouted over the comms. The battle erupted. Blaster fire lit up the sky as ships weaved between explosions. Zane gritted his teeth, gripping the controls tightly as he dodged incoming fire. He was no ace pilot, but years of flying cargo had taught him a few tricks. The resistance ships pushed forward, forcing their way through the enemy lines. Vera directed their course toward the heart of the fortress, where Drax's artifact was kept. "We need to land inside," she said urgently. "That artifact has to be destroyed, or this fight will never end." Zane nodded and pushed the ship into a steep dive, heading straight for the landing bay. They hit the ground running. Resistance fighters poured out of the ships, engaging Drax's forces in brutal combat. Explosions shook the walls as blaster fire filled the air. Zane and Vera sprinted through the chaos, heading deeper into the fortress. They knew where they had to go. Drax was waiting for them. The warlord stood at the center of the artifact chamber, his dark armor gleaming under the eerie blue glow of the ancient relic. The artifact pulsed with power, tendrils of energy flowing through the walls like veins. Vera stopped short, her breath catching. "You're too late," Drax said, his voice deep and full of arrogance. "The artifact is stronger than ever. My rule is inevitable." Zane raised his blaster, but Drax moved faster. With a flick of his hand, the warlord sent a wave of energy crashing into them, throwing them backward. Zane hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his body. Vera struggled to her feet, her eyes blazing. You betrayed my people, she spat. Used us, lied to us. But today it ends. Drax laughed. You think you can stop me? Vera clenched her fists, then turned to Zane. The artifact. We have to destroy it. Zane scrambled toward the massive glowing crystal, dodging blasts of energy as Drax attacked. The artifact pulsed violently, its power growing unstable. Vera charged at Drax, engaging him in a desperate fight. She was fast, her movements precise, but Drax was stronger. He knocked her to the ground, pinning her down with one massive hand. You should have stayed hidden, he growled. Zane saw the desperation in Vera's eyes. He had to act now. Ignoring the pain in his body, he grabbed a detonator from his belt and slammed it against the artifact's core. The device beeped rapidly, its countdown beginning. Drax's eyes widened. No. He released Vera and lunged for Zane. But Vera reacted faster. She drove a hidden blade into Drax's side, twisting it deep. The warlord roared in agony, staggering backward. Zane grabbed Vera's hand. We have to go. The artifact crackled wildly, its energy spiraling out of control. They ran. Behind them, the detonator hit zero. The explosion was blinding. The entire chamber erupted in a wave of blue fire, consuming everything in its path. The fortress shook violently, metal and stone crumbling as the artifact's power collapsed. Zane and Vera barely made it outside before the entire structure caved in, sending a massive shockwave across the battlefield. The hunters, now without the artifact's influence, turned on each other, their control broken. The resistance fighters pushed forward, driving Drax's forces into full retreat. The war was over. Hours later, Zane and Vera stood on a quiet hill overlooking the ruins of Drax's stronghold. The resistance had won. Vera turned to Zane, her expression soft. It's over, she said, almost in disbelief. Zane chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. You know, I never expected my life to turn out like this. Vera smiled, stepping closer. Neither did I. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Vera reached out, taking his hand in hers. Thank you, Zane, she whispered. Zane looked into her glowing eyes, seeing not just gratitude, but something deeper, something he hadn't expected when he first saved her. He smiled. I didn't know the alien woman I saved would eventually become my wife. Vera laughed softly. Well, life is full of surprises. Zane squeezed her hand, knowing that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at home. The end.